In August 2005, a storm formed over the Atlantic Ocean that would become one of the deadliest hurricanes in United States history. What began as a tropical disturbance strengthened over warm waters, gaining intensity as it moved toward the Gulf Coast. Meteorologists issued warnings, but few could imagine the scale of destruction to come. New Orleans, largely below sea level, was especially vulnerable. Its levees and flood walls, designed to protect against routine flooding, were not built to withstand a hurricane of Katrina's magnitude. Some residents evacuated, but thousands stayed, believing the city could withstand the storm or lacking the means to leave. On August 29th, Hurricane Katrina made landfall. Winds tore through buildings, trees snapped, and torrential rain fell. The storm surge overwhelmed levees, which failed in multiple locations. Floodwaters poured into neighborhoods, submerging homes and sweeping vehicles away. Residents climbed onto rooftops and attics to survive, while emergency responders struggled to reach them as streets vanished beneath the water. The scale of devastation was immense. Thousands were displaced, entire communities wiped out. Hospitals, schools, and businesses were incapacitated. Families waited in fear, uncertain if loved ones had survived. The storm destroyed both property and daily life, leaving residents exposed in the days that followed. Rescue operations began, but coordination was chaotic. Communication lines were down, roads impassable, and resources insufficient. Temporary shelters were overcrowded with limited food, water, and medical care. Frustration grew as the slow response highlighted weaknesses in emergency planning and infrastructure. Investigations later revealed a mix of natural and human causes. Katrina's strength was unprecedented, but poorly maintained levees, delayed repairs, and flawed infrastructure worsened the impact. Social and economic inequalities meant the most vulnerable suffered disproportionately. The disaster exposed how assumptions and inaction can leave societies unprepared, even with warnings. Rebuilding was extensive but uneven. Some neighborhoods recovered quickly, others remained abandoned. Policies were revised, disaster management updated, and levees strengthened. Yet survivors carried lasting trauma. The storm permanently altered communities, livelihoods, and trust in safety systems. Hurricane Katrina became a symbol of the fragile balance between nature and society. It demonstrated that even advanced infrastructure cannot guarantee safety when warnings are ignored. The storm remains a reminder that disasters are rarely sudden. They are the culmination of long-term vulnerability meeting overwhelming force. Its legacy continues in altered landscapes, displaced populations, and lessons that must not be forgotten. After the floodwaters receded, New Orleans faced the full scale of Katrina's devastation. Thousands had lost homes, businesses, and possessions entire. Neighborhoods were submerged or destroyed, streets filled with debris wrecked. Cars and broken buildings. Survivors walked through areas they barely recognized, often finding nothing but waterlogged ruins. The storm had erased both property and the daily routines people relied upon for generations. Displacement became widespread. Over 1 million residents were forced to leave, moving to nearby cities, or far across the country. Shelters became long-term residences. Families were separated. Schools remained closed, and workplaces were shut for months. Returning residents often found neighborhoods abandoned or heavily damaged, and rebuilding required resources that were scarce or difficult to access. The social consequences were stark. Vulnerable populations, low-income families, the elderly, and those without transportation suffered. The most their recovery was slowest, revealing systemic inequalities in access to housing, healthcare, and emergency services. Communities that were already marginalized faced the worst losses forced to contend with both the disaster and its social fallout. Government response came under intense scrutiny. Investigations revealed delays in rescue efforts, poor coordination among agencies, and communication failures. While many first responders acted heroically, the overall system failed to meet the scale of need. Lawsuits and inquiries examined why warnings had been underestimated and infrastructure maintenance had been inadequate. Rebuilding and mitigation efforts began gradually. Federal funding, state programs, and private donations helped reconstruct levees, infrastructure, and housing. Urban planners redesigned parts of the city to withstand future storms, incorporating lessons from Katrina emergency. Protocols were updated, including evacuation procedures and disaster response. Some neighborhoods recovered quickly, others remained abandoned for years. The physical and emotional scars persisted. Across the region, economic and cultural impacts were long-lasting. Tourism, commerce, and local industries suffered. Neighborhood traditions and community events were interrupted. At the same time, stories of resilience emerged. Citizens organized volunteer efforts, shared resources, and supported neighbors, forming networks that became lifelines in the slow recovery process. Katrina's aftermath highlighted the intersection of natural disaster infrastructure, failure, and social inequality. It showed how prolonged vulnerability can amplify sudden catastrophe. The storm's legacy influenced urban planning, disaster preparedness, and emergency management worldwide. Even years later, the lessons of Katrina remain a reminder that disasters are rarely isolated. They result from both natural forces and systemic weaknesses. Communities continue to rebuild, adapt, and remember, knowing that vigilance, equity, and resilience are essential to surviving such events. As days passed, conditions inside the flooded city grew worse. Heat was intense, supplies were scarce, and medical care was limited. Many people were stranded without information, unsure if help was coming. The smell of stagnant water and debris filled the air as fires broke out in some areas and basic services remained non-existent. Elderly residents and those with medical conditions suffered the most as hospitals struggled to operate without power or clean water. National attention focused on the slow response. Questions were raised about why help had not arrived sooner And why evacuation plans failed to protect the most vulnerable. Images broadcast across the world showed families stranded on rooftops, children waiting in lines for water, and neighborhoods completely underwater. Public trust in government institutions weakened as confusion and frustration mounted. People demanded accountability as they watched the crisis unfold in real time. Eventually, large-scale rescue and relief operations expanded. Thousands were airlifted or transported out of the city to shelters across multiple states. For many evacuees, the journey marked the beginning of a long, uncertain future. Homes were destroyed, jobs were gone, and familiar communities were scattered. Families were forced to rebuild their lives far from everything they knew, while waiting for news about whether return was possible. When rebuilding began, it was slow, uneven, and painful. Insurance disputes, funding delays, and policy changes complicated recovery. Some neighborhoods received resources quickly, while others were left behind. Residents who returned faced mold, damaged infrastructure, and limited access to schools and healthcare. The city itself began to change as population shifts altered culture, housing, and local economies. Longtime residents worried about losing not just homes, but identity. Years later, Katrina remained more than a storm. It became a reference point for disaster planning, inequality, and resilience. Researchers studied it, policymakers debated it, and survivors lived with its consequences. The lessons were clear but costly, that preparation matters. Infrastructure must be maintained and warnings must be taken seriously. The storm exposed weaknesses that had existed for decades and forced them into the open. Hurricane Katrina did not end when the water receded. Its impact stretched across years, generations, and systems, shaping how disasters are understood and handled. The memory lives on in rebuilt streets, empty lots, and the stories of those who survived. It stands as a reminder that disasters are not only acts of nature, but tests of society and the choices made long before the storm arrives.
Years after the flood, many survivors were still trying to rebuild their lives. Families remained displaced, living in temporary housing or settling in new cities far from home. Returning to New Orleans was uneven, with some neighborhoods slowly repopulating while others stayed empty. Streets that once held generations of families felt unfamiliar and quiet. The emotional impact lingered long after physical damage was repaired. Many survivors lived with anxiety, depression, and trauma from the fear, loss, and uncertainty they experienced. Children carried memories of evacuation and separation, while adults struggled with financial stress and instability. Mental health support expanded, but access was limited, especially in communities hit hardest. Rebuilding the city brought difficult changes. Construction reshaped neighborhoods, raising housing costs and pushing longtime residents out. Redevelopment created tension between preservation and progress, as people worried cultural identity would disappear. Music, food, and local traditions became acts of resistance against displacement and loss. Government reforms followed the disaster. Emergency planning, evacuation routes, and levee systems were redesigned. Engineers studied failures to prevent collapse. Communication between agencies improved, and disaster response protocols were rewritten. These changes were driven by lessons learned from mistakes that had cost lives during the storm. Despite improvements, many felt left behind. Recovery funds were uneven, and inequalities became impossible to ignore. Katrina was no longer seen as only a hurricane, but as evidence of systemic neglect affecting the poorest communities. The disaster forced conversations about race, poverty, and access to protection. Over time, Katrina became part of national memory. Survivors shared stories, schools taught its lessons, and researchers studied its impact. The storm proved recovery takes generations, not months. New Orleans moved forward carrying resilience and warning, knowing remembrance is essential for survival. The city remained standing, but it no longer felt alive. Streets were quiet and stained with marks showing how high the water had reached. Silence replaced the sounds that once filled daily life. People moved carefully through neighborhoods, taking note of what was gone and what might never return. The storm had passed, but its presence lingered in every block and building. Time moved strangely for survivors. Days blended together as inspections, paperwork, and waiting became routine. Recovery felt uneven and distant. Some areas saw rebuilding and signs of progress, while others stayed broken and overlooked. Residents questioned whether rebuilding meant healing or simply surviving long enough to move forward. Families stayed scattered across the country. Children grew up in places they never expected to call home. Accents changed, routines shifted, and memories of New Orleans became stories passed down rather than lived experiences. The city existed in fragments connected by memory, music, and shared loss. Trust in institutions was slow to return. Survivors remembered confusion, delays, and absence during the most critical moments. Promises of reform and preparedness were met with caution as people questioned whether systems would truly hold when tested again by another storm. As years passed, Katrina became history for some and daily reality for others. Empty lots stood beside rebuilt homes, reminders that recovery is never equal. Culture endured through music, food, and tradition, refusing to disappear even as the city continued to change. Each hurricane season reopened old wounds. Forecasts, rain, and sirens carried emotional weight. Katrina never truly ended. It evolved into a warning, reference, and lesson, shaping how people prepared and how leaders spoke. What remained was memory and consequence. A city altered lives, reshaped, and a nation reminded that disasters are not single moments, but outcomes shaped by choices, neglect, and preparation long before landfall and remembered long after the water recedes.